Christmas night. Echo 7 buried in the blizzard. Lights out. Radio silent. She stood alone in the frozen concrete yard, rifle heavy as fate in her hands. They had withdrawn. They had left her behind. When the radar flashed 92 heat signatures closing in, no artillery, no helicopters, no reinforcements. Just one woman, one empty base, and 8 hours to survive. If Echo 7 fell tonight, the entire defensive line would collapse before Christmas dawn. Echo 7 had been dying for months before that Christmas Eve. Captain Sarah Brennan knew it the moment she arrived in September. The outpost sat on a rocky ridge in the northern mountains, 300 miles from anything that mattered. The buildings were Soviet-era concrete blocks, painted over with American beige. The fence sagged. The satellite dish pointed at nothing. Strategic monitoring station, they called it in the briefing. Translation: a place to put people the Army wanted to forget. Sarah was 34, 12 years in, Ranger qualified, 2 tours that taught her how to read terrain like a book and men like headlines. She should have been leading platoons. Instead, she got Echo 7 and its skeleton crew of 8 soldiers who rotated every 6 weeks. By December, even they were gone. Budget cuts, they said. Consolidation. The war was winding down. Bases like Echo 7 were relics. She spent her days maintaining equipment that barely functioned and filing reports nobody read. The radio played Christmas music when the signal was strong enough. She'd hung a fake tree in the command center as a joke. Its plastic branches drooped under the weight of icicles that formed from the leaking roof. December 24th started like any other dead day. 0600 hours. Temperature, -15 Celsius. Wind, 30 knots. Visibility, quarter mile in blowing snow. Sarah ran diagnostics on the perimeter sensors. Half were offline. The thermal imaging system flickered like a dying heartbeat. She logged it in the maintenance file that would never be read. The supply drone was 3 days late. Not unusual. Nothing about Echo 7 was priority. But at 1,300 hours, something changed. The reconnaissance drone she'd sent out at dawn didn't return on schedule. Sarah waited 30 minutes past its window. Nothing. She checked the backup frequencies. Static. She pulled up the tracking data. The drone's last ping came from grid 47 north, 20 kilometers out. Then nothing. Not a malfunction signal, not a crash beacon. Just absence. Sarah felt the first cold touch of unease. She tried to raise battalion command. The satellite uplink was spotty in the storm, but she should have gotten through. Instead, she got silence, dead air. She cycled through emergency frequencies. Nothing. At 1,500 hours, the power stuttered. The generators were old, temperamental, but this felt different. The lights dimmed, then steadied. The computer screens flickered. Sarah checked the fuel levels. Full. She ran a manual diagnostic. Everything read normal. Yet, something was wrong. She could feel it the way soldiers learn to feel enemy eyes in empty streets. She suited up and went outside. The blizzard hit like a wall. Snow whipped horizontal across the compound. The perimeter lights were dim halos in the white chaos. Sarah made her way to the generator building, ice forming on her goggles. Inside, the machines rumbled steady, no problems she could see. But when she turned to leave, she noticed something. Fresh boot prints in the snow near the fuel tanks. Not hers. She'd been the only person on base for 3 weeks. The prints were already filling with snow, less than an hour old. Sarah's hand moved to her sidearm. She scanned the white void beyond the fence. Nothing. No movement, no sound but the wind. She followed the prints. They led to the eastern fence line, then disappeared through a gap in the wire. Someone had been inside the perimeter. Sarah radioed battalion command again. Still nothing. She tried the emergency distress frequency. Static. She went back to the command center and pulled up the perimeter camera feeds. Most were useless in the storm, showing only white static. But camera 7, facing east, had captured something at 1,422 hours. A figure, blurred by snow, moving fast along the fence, then gone. Not a deer, not a shadow, a person. Sarah's jaw tightened. She wasn't paranoid. She was alone on a dying base in hostile territory, and someone had just performed reconnaissance on her position. She locked the main doors and began checking weapon systems. At 1,700 hours, the order came through. The satellite link crackled to life for exactly 90 seconds, long enough for a pre-recorded message from Colonel Marcus Hayward, Sector Commander. Echo 7. This is Hayward. Effective immediately, all personnel are to evacuate to Rally Point Sierra. Strategic reassessment requires temporary abandonment of forward monitoring stations. Extraction helicopters inbound. This is not a drill. Acknowledge. Sarah keyed the mic. Sir, Echo 7 actual. I'm the only personnel on station. What's the nature of the threat? But the link was already dead. 90 seconds. Just enough for orders, not enough for questions. Sarah stared at the radio. Something was very wrong. The helicopters came at 1,900 hours, 2 Black Hawks, flying low through the storm. They didn't land in the designated LZ. They touched down on the southern edge of the compound, rotors scattering snow like shrapnel. Sarah grabbed her go-bag and ran out. The lead pilot, a lieutenant she'd never seen before, shouted over the rotor wash, "You, Brennan? You're staying." Sarah froze. "What? Orders! You maintain the base until relief arrives. 0600 tomorrow. That's 11 hours. What's happening? Need someone to secure the equipment. You're it. They'll send transport at dawn." The logic was insane. If they were evacuating, they evacuated everyone. If they were holding the base, they left a full crew. "I need to speak to Colonel Hayward." "No time. Orders are orders, Captain." The second helicopter was already lifting off. The lieutenant pointed at a crate they dumped in the snow. "Extra rations. Radio if you need anything." "The radio's not working." "Fix it. You've got 11 hours. Then he was gone. Both birds climbing into the white darkness, their lights swallowed by the storm. Sarah stood alone in the rotor wash, snow settling on her shoulders. She looked at the crate. Inside, 3 MREs and a broken radio antenna. Not supplies for 11 hours. Trash they didn't want to carry. The wind howled. The base was empty. The generators hummed their indifferent song. Sarah dragged the crate inside and locked the door. She tried the radio every frequency she knew. Nothing. She checked the satellite uplink. Offline. She pulled up the command network on the computer. Access denied. Her security clearance had been revoked. Sarah sat very still. Her breath made clouds in the cold command center. Outside, the storm screamed. This wasn't evacuation. This wasn't temporary. They had abandoned Echo 7. And they'd left her behind to maintain the fiction of an orderly withdrawal. The question was, why? At 2,100 hours, the radar began to ping. Sarah had been trying to restore the satellite link when the proximity alarm chirped. She spun to the thermal imaging display. 8 contacts. Eastern approach. 2 kilometers out. She watched. The contacts moved slowly, spread in a loose line. Tactical formation. Not friendly. Friendlies would have announced themselves. Sarah armed herself. M4 rifle, sidearm, 4 magazines, knife. She killed the interior lights and moved to the observation post. Through night vision binoculars, she could barely see through the storm. Shapes moving, low and deliberate. The contacts paused at 1 kilometer. For 10 minutes, they didn't move. Then the radar lit up like a Christmas tree. Contacts bloomed across the screen. North, east, south, converging from 3 directions. Sarah counted. Her hands went cold. 92. 92 individual heat signatures, moving in coordinated groups toward Echo 7. This wasn't a patrol. This wasn't reconnaissance. This was an assault force. Sarah's mind raced. Echo 7 had no strategic value. It monitored empty mountains. The equipment was outdated. The position was indefensible. Unless someone knew the Americans were abandoning it. Unless someone wanted a foothold on this ridge before dawn. Unless this was exactly why they'd pulled everyone out. Sarah reached for the radio. Dead. She tried the emergency beacon. Nothing. She was alone. No support. No extraction. No way to call for help. 92 hostiles closing on her position. The logical choice was obvious. Run. Take her rifle and disappear into the mountains. Survive in the wilderness until she could reach friendly lines. But as Sarah looked at the radar display at the careful, coordinated movement of the assault teams, she knew what would happen if she ran. They would take Echo 7 by sunrise. They would fortify it. They would turn it into a forward operating base that could threaten the entire valley. By the time Command realized the mistake, it would take a battalion to dig them out. And how many soldiers would die retaking ground that should never have been lost? Sarah looked at the fake Christmas tree in the corner, at the tactical map on the wall, at the rifle in her hands. She'd sworn an oath, not to politicians, not to commanders who abandoned her, but to the soldiers who would have to bleed for her failure. 12 years in, she knew how to read terrain, she knew how to fight, and she knew Echo 7 better than anyone alive. Sarah's hands stopped shaking. She pulled up the base defense protocols on the computer. Time to make 92 people regret coming to her base on Christmas. Sarah had 2 hours before first contact. She moved fast. Echo 7 was a dying base, but it wasn't defenseless. Years of paranoid Cold War engineering had left gifts buried in the infrastructure. First, the perimeter sensors. Sarah rebooted the system and recalibrated every active node. Half were broken, but half of 40 was still 20 eyes watching the approaches. She set them to feed directly to her tablet. Second, the Claymore mines. Echo 7's arms room had 8 M18A1s gathering dust. Sarah had test-fired 2 during a bored afternoon in October. 6 remained. She placed them at choke points, the main gate, the generator building, the gap in the eastern fence. She ran the detonation wires back to the command center. 6 switches, 6 surprises. Third, lighting. The base had external floods for night operations. Sarah rewired them to a remote switch. She could trigger blackout or full illumination in seconds. In a blizzard, sudden light was disorienting. She'd use it once, maybe twice. Fourth, sound. She hooked speakers to the PA system and loaded audio files, radio chatter, vehicle engines, shouted orders. She could make Echo 7 sound occupied by dozens. Fifth, heat signatures. Sarah turned on every heater in every building and opened the vents. Thermal imaging would show hot spots across the compound. Make them guess where she actually was. Sixth, movement. She rigged pulleys to window blinds, set fans to rock doors. Small motions that would catch the eye through rifle scopes. At 2,245 hours, she made her final preparation. She chose her fighting positions. 8 spots throughout the base where she had cover, firing lanes, and escape routes. She pre-positioned ammunition at each, 2 magazines minimum. Medical supplies, water. She memorized the routes between them. Timing, 30 seconds from command center to generator building, 45 seconds to the mess hall, 20 to the armory. Sarah had fought in cities. She knew urban combat. The defender's advantage wasn't numbers, it was knowledge. She knew every corner, every shadow, every sightline. They were walking into her home. At 2,315 hours, she made coffee, hot and black. She'd need it. At 2,330 hours, she checked her rifle, cleaned, loaded, sighted. At 2,345 hours, she opened the command center safe and took out the medals inside. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, photos of her family. She put them in her inner pocket, close to her heart. If she died tonight, they'd burn with her. At 2,355 hours, radar showed the first assault team crossing the 1-kilometer mark. Sarah killed the lights, put in her earpiece, checked the remote triggers one last time. Then she picked up her rifle and moved to position 1, the northwest corner of the command center, with sightlines to the main gate and eastern approach. She knelt in the darkness, controlled her breathing, let her heart rate settle. The snow fell. The wind howled. The radar pinged. 500 meters. Sarah's finger rested alongside the trigger guard. "Merry Christmas," she whispered to the darkness. They came at midnight. The first team hit the eastern fence at 0005 hours. 4 men, professional. They moved in a tight diamond, weapons up, scanning for threats. Sarah watched through night vision from 90 meters away. They cut the wire efficiently. No noise, no wasted motion. The lead man entered the compound. He hand-signaled. 2 more followed. The 4th stayed outside as rear security. They moved toward the generator building, hugging the shadows. Sarah didn't fire. Not yet. She watched them check the door, Locked. One produced a pry bar, the second stood cover, the third scanned their six. Good discipline. Well trained. They forced the door and entered the building, checking for defenders, for intel, for anything useful. Sarah counted to 30. Then she pressed the detonation switch. The claymore mine she'd mounted inside the generator room exploded with a sound like God slamming a door. The blast wave shattered windows, shrapnel tore through corrugated metal. Silence. Then screaming. One voice, abruptly cut off. Sarah watched the fourth man at the fence. He dropped prone, rifle aimed at the building. Discipline held. She put her crosshairs on his center mass and squeezed. The suppressed rifle coughed. The man jerked and went still. Sarah was already moving. Position 1 to position 2. 30 seconds through the connecting corridor. She locked the door behind her and took up the new angle. The compound was silent again. Wind and snow. Through her tablet, she watched thermal signatures. The assault force had stopped advancing, regrouping, reassessing. They'd expected an empty base. They'd found a trap. Sarah waited. Controlled breathing. Rifle ready. At 0023 hours, they tried again. This time, 2 teams. 8 men, converging from north and south simultaneously. Sarah triggered the PA system. Recorded radio chatter blared from speakers across the compound. Contact east, contact east. We need suppression fire. The assault teams hesitated, confused, looking for the source. Sarah fired 3 rounds into the northern team. One hit, the others scattered. She triggered the lights, full floods. The compound blazed white. Blinded in the sudden glare, the assault teams froze. Sarah put 2 more rounds downrange, then killed the lights and moved. Position 2 to position 3. 45 seconds. She passed the fake Christmas tree, its plastic branches casting shadows in the emergency lighting. The assault teams pulled back, regrouping again. Sarah checked her ammunition. 14 rounds expended, 266 remaining. She'd made them pay for the first hour. But 92 minus 5 still left 87. And they were learning. By 0200 hours, the blizzard had become a whiteout. Visibility, 0. Wind, 40 knots. Temperature, minus 20. Sarah could barely see 10 meters. The thermal sensors were useless in the snow. She was fighting blind. So were they. The assault force changed tactics. No more coordinated advances. They sent small teams, 2 or 3 fighters probing from different directions, testing her responses, mapping her positions. Sarah couldn't be everywhere. At 0215, they breached the southern fence. She heard the wire cutters in the storm. By the time she repositioned, they were inside. She caught one in the open and dropped him. The others vanished into the buildings. Now they were inside her perimeter, hunting her in her own base. Sarah moved through the corridors like a ghost. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every blind corner. They didn't. She caught the second man in the mess hall. He was checking supply crates when she appeared in the doorway. Their eyes met for half a second. She fired first. The third man found her. Sarah was moving between positions when he stepped out of a side room. They collided in the narrow hallway. No time to aim, no time to think. They fought hand to hand. He was bigger, stronger. He slammed her against the wall. Her rifle clattered away. Sarah drove her knee into his groin. He grunted but didn't release. She got her knife out and stabbed blindly. The blade caught his arm. He roared and threw her down. She rolled, came up with the knife. He had his rifle. They faced each other in the dark hallway. He fired. The round creased her shoulder, pain like fire. Sarah threw the knife. It buried in his throat. He dropped, choking, dying. Sarah retrieved her rifle with shaking hands. Blood soaked her jacket. The shoulder wound wasn't deep, but it burned like acid. She stumbled to position 4 and collapsed behind cover. Her medical kit was there. She packed the wound with gauze and wrapped it tight. Outside, the storm screamed. Sarah checked her tablet. 53 heat signatures remaining. They'd lost nearly 40 fighters, but they weren't retreating. At 0300 hours, they launched a full assault. Every approach simultaneously. 20 fighters rushing the compound in the whiteout. Sarah triggered the remaining claymores. Explosions bloomed in the snow. The PA system blared more fake radio traffic. She fired until her barrel ran hot. Bodies fell. Some got up, some didn't. When the assault broke, Sarah had 17 rounds left in her current magazine and a bleeding shoulder that throbbed with every heartbeat. She'd held them for 3 hours. 5 more to go. At 0000 hours exactly, a sound cut through the storm. Music. The radio in the command center, the one that had been dead all evening, suddenly crackled to life. A recording. Automatic timer. Silent Night played through the static. An old version, scratchy, beautiful. Sarah stood in the darkness, blood dripping from her fingertips, listening to the Christmas carol echo through the empty bass. She'd forgotten about the timer. Set it a week ago as a joke. Midnight on Christmas. Something to mark the moment when she would have been alone anyway. But she wasn't alone. She had company. 47 heat signatures on the radar. All waiting, all watching. Sarah leaned against the wall. Her shoulder screamed. Her ammunition was running low. She was exhausted, cold, bleeding. The music played. Silent Night, Holy Night. She thought about Christmas 12 years ago, before the army, before the wars, before she learned how to kill. Her mother had made cinnamon rolls. Her father had burned the turkey. Her little brother had opened his presents at 5 a.m. and woken everyone up. She'd been 22, invincible, certain the world made sense. How far she'd traveled since then. How much blood under the bridge. The song ended. Static returned, then silence. Sarah checked her rifle. 5 magazines left. 150 rounds. She thought about surrender. They'd probably take her alive, prisoner, intel value. But she knew what came after. The interrogations, the propaganda videos, the years in a cell. And she knew what Echo 7's fall would mean. Strategic nightmare, operational disaster, a foothold for the enemy in terrain that would cost hundreds of lives to reclaim. She'd made her choice at 2,100 hours when she could have run. She'd make it again now. Sarah pushed off the wall. The cold air bit at her wounds. She checked her gear methodically. Rifle, functional. Sidearm, loaded. Magazines, 5 remaining. Each one precious. Each round would have to count now. She reloaded with practiced efficiency. Moved to position 5 through the maintenance tunnel. 30 seconds of crawling through freezing darkness. Her shoulder protested every movement. At 0030 hours, she heard movement in the western corridor. They'd sent someone alone. Quiet, careful, a scout, maybe, or bait. Sarah waited in the darkness, controlling her breathing, making no sound, becoming part of the shadows. The footsteps came closer, slow, deliberate, professional movement. He turned the corner, young, maybe 20, wide eyes, scanning the shadows with night vision goggles. Sarah shot him in the chest. He fell. His rifle clattered. He made a sound like air escaping a tire. Sarah didn't move, listened. More footsteps, running. They'd heard the shot. She triggered the last light trap. The hallway blazed. 2 more fighters rushing in. Sarah fired twice. Both dropped. Then the lights died. She'd blown the circuit. Darkness again. Ringing silence. Sarah ejected her magazine. 3 rounds left. She replaced it with a fresh one. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. Somewhere in the storm, the enemy commander was making calculations. 44 fighters left. Hours until dawn. 1 defender who'd already killed dozens. Was Echo 7 worth it? Sarah hoped he'd decide it wasn't, that they'd withdraw, that she'd see the sunrise. But the radar showed they were regrouping for another assault. They wanted this base, and they'd pay the price. At 0530 hours, 30 minutes before dawn, they came with everything they had. 38 fighters, every approach, overwhelming force. Sarah was down to 4 magazines, 60 rounds. The shoulder wound had reopened. She was dizzy from blood loss. Her hands shook. She'd killed the lights throughout the base to conserve power. She fought in complete darkness, navigating by memory and sound. They blew the main gate with explosives. The blast shook the compound. Smoke and snow poured through the breach. Sarah fired from position 6. Dropped 2. Moved. They swept the command center. She wasn't there. She'd abandoned it an hour ago. They swept the barracks. She wasn't there. They were hunting her in the dark, and she was hunting them. Sarah caught 3 fighters in the armory. They died not knowing where the shots came from. She caught 2 more in the corridor. Close range. No mercy. Her ammunition was running out. 35 rounds. 30. 25. At 0600 hours, she was down to 1 magazine. 15 rounds between her and death. Sarah fell back to her final position, the generator room. She'd turned it into a bunker. Reinforced door, firing slits, no other exits. If they wanted her, they'd have to come through that door. She could hear them outside, calling to each other, coordinating. 15 rounds. Sarah divided them mentally. 5 for the door assault, 5 for backup, 5 to save. The door shuddered. They were placing charges. Sarah aimed her rifle, controlled her breathing. This was it. The last stand. She thought about her family, her friends, the soldiers she'd served with, the ones who'd died, the ones who'd lived. She thought about the oath she'd sworn, the flag on the wall, the medals in her pocket. She wasn't afraid. The door exploded inward. Sarah fired into the smoke. 1, 2, 3. Bodies falling. They returned fire. Rounds ricocheted off concrete. 1 grazed her leg. She fired again. 4, 5, 6. The assault faltered. They pulled back. Sarah reloaded her last magazine. 9 rounds. She waited. They tried again. Grenades first. Flashbangs. The room filled with smoke and fire. Sarah curled into a corner, protected by a steel cabinet. The blast wave hammered her. Then they rushed. Sarah fired blind. 7, 8, 9. The rifle clicked empty. She dropped it and drew her sidearm. A figure emerged from the smoke, rifle raised. Sarah fired first. He fell. She fired again. Another fell. Her sidearm clicked empty. Sarah drew her knife. The last fighter came through the door. They faced each other in the ruined generator room, both out of ammunition, both bleeding, both exhausted. He was older, scarred, professional. He smiled sadly, raised his own knife. They circled, waiting for the opening. Then, from outside, a sound. Engines, rotors, helicopters. The fighter's eyes widened. He looked toward the door. Sarah didn't hesitate. She lunged. Her knife found his chest. He fell. Sarah collapsed against the wall. The knife slipped from her fingers. Through the broken door, she could see the sky. The blizzard had stopped. Dawn was breaking. Christmas morning. The helicopters grew louder. Sarah closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. They found her at 0645 hours. Major Elizabeth Cortez led the quick reaction force that landed at Echo 7. 8 helicopters. 100 soldiers. They'd expected a massacre. Intelligence had suggested enemy forces had taken the base during the night. The relief force was prepared for heavy resistance. Instead, they found silence. Bodies everywhere. 91 enemy fighters, most outside the perimeter, some inside, some in pieces. The base itself was a war zone. Blast craters, bullet holes, blood frozen in the snow. And in the generator room, Captain Sarah Brennan, unconscious, covered in blood, surrounded by brass casings and dead enemies. Cortez knelt beside her, checked for a pulse, found one, weak but steady. "Medic," she shouted, "we have a survivor." The combat medics rushed in. They stabilized Sarah's wounds, started an IV, loaded her onto a stretcher. As they carried her out, Cortez walked through Echo 7. She'd been in combat for 15 years. She'd seen firefights. She'd seen desperate last stands. But this was something else. 1 soldier, 92 attackers, 8 hours. And the base still stood. Cortez found the fake Christmas tree in the command center. Plastic branches, cheap ornaments, a reminder of normalcy in a place forgotten by everyone. Except Sarah Brennan hadn't forgotten. She'd stayed. She'd fought. She'd held the line. The casualty report was unbelievable. 91 confirmed enemy dead. Sarah Brennan critical but stable. The intelligence assessment was worse. The enemy force had been an advance element for a larger operation. They'd planned to seize Echo 7 and use it as a staging point for attacks on the valley below. If they'd succeeded, the entire sector would have collapsed. Sarah Brennan had stopped it. Alone. On the helicopter ride back to base, Cortez sat with Sarah's personal effects. Medals. Photos. A blood-stained notebook. The last entry was dated December 24th, 2,100 hours. 92 contacts. No support, no extraction. Probably won't survive, but they won't take this base. Not on my watch. Not on Christmas. Cortez closed the notebook, looked at the unconscious woman on the stretcher. Heroes weren't supposed to be real. They were supposed to be propaganda, stories to inspire recruits. But Sarah Brennan was real, and what she'd done was real. Cortez made a decision. This story would be told. This woman would be honored. The helicopter banked toward the rising sun. Christmas morning, a new day. The official report was filed on January 15th. It stated that Echo 7 had been evacuated on December 24th as part of a strategic redeployment. Enemy forces had attempted to occupy the abandoned base but were repelled by defensive measures and timely air support. Captain Sarah Brennan was mentioned once, assisted in the defense. No medal, no commendation, no public recognition. The classified addendum told a different story. It detailed Sarah's 8-hour defense, the tactical brilliance, the impossible odds, the strategic implications. But it concluded that publicizing the incident would raise uncomfortable questions about why Sarah had been left behind, about the decision to evacuate, about command failures. Better to let it fade, better to keep it quiet. Sarah recovered at a military hospital in Germany. Shrapnel wounds, gunshot wounds, frostbite, severe exhaustion. She was visited once by Colonel Hayward. He stood by her bed, uncomfortable, looking anywhere but at her. "I followed orders," he said. "The withdrawal was, we didn't know enemy forces were in the area." Sarah said nothing. "You did well," Hayward continued. "Exceptional work. We're grateful." Sarah watched him. "Who gave the order to leave me?" "That's classified." "Who knew about the attack?" "Captain, that's not." "Did they leave me there to die? Or did they leave me there to slow the enemy down?" Hayward's silence was answer enough. He left without another word. Sarah was medically retired in March. Full disability. Pension. A quiet ceremony with no press. She went home to Montana, bought a small house in the mountains, tried to forget, but Echo 7 wouldn't let her go. Other soldiers knew. The ones who'd flown the relief mission. The ones who'd seen the aftermath. They talked. Quietly. In bars and barracks, the story spread. The woman who'd held a base alone against 92 attackers. The Christmas miracle. It became a legend. The kind soldiers tell each other. The kind that gives you courage when you're scared. The kind that reminds you what one person can do when they refuse to quit. 1 year later, Christmas Eve, Sarah drove back to Echo 7. The base was still abandoned. The fence still sagged. The buildings were empty. But someone had been there recently. Someone had placed a wreath on the main gate. And a plaque, unofficial, made by hand. Echo 7, defended by Captain Sarah Brennan. Christmas, 2024. 1 soldier, 8 hours, 92 enemies, 0 ground lost. Sarah stood in the snow, looking at the plaque. At the base she'd bled for. The place they'd left her to die. The place she'd refused to surrender. The wind blew cold off the mountains. The same wind that had blown that Christmas night. Sarah turned back to her truck. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need medals. She knew what she'd done, and that was enough. As she drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror. Echo 7 stood quiet against the winter sky. Empty, forgotten, but still standing. Defiant, unbroken, always standing, still standing.